He didn't think anyone could stop him. The man with a stiff smile on his face took a step forward, blocking the woman's path. His voice was full of contempt as he began to speak, deliberately throwing hurtful words and appraising glances in her direction. The black woman stood still, but there was no fear in her eyes. She knew that men like him were used to thinking they were the masters of life, used to thinking that there would be no retribution for their actions. Everything was happening too fast. With each passing second, the tension between them grew like a taut string, ready to break. The man couldn't even imagine the power this woman had. He had thought that its insolence and racist taunts would go unpunished, but the harsh reality caught up with him unexpectedly. The sudden revelation of her true identity struck him like lightning. Despair flashed across his face, fear frowned in his eyes, and he realized he'd made a fatal mistake. Without wasting a second, he turned and ran, leaving a trail of his own shame and panic behind him. Friends, your names and stories are as important to us as this one. Write in the comments what your name is and where you're watching this video from. We read every post, appreciate your support, and know that you are what makes our channel stronger. Your participation helps us grow and tell even more important and inspiring stories. Thank you for being with us. You truly are the heart of our community. Enjoy the show. The dusty rays of the evening sun burst from the horizon, painting the city in ominous hues. The hot air was saturated with tension, as if the street itself sensed that something terrible was about to happen. Through this atmosphere walked a man. His gait was confident, defiant. He was used to being the master, used to seeing only weakness in people. His eyes, cold and filled with contempt, fixed on the woman standing nearby. She was black-skinned. Her skin glowed against the dusk, but it was that glow that made his heart surge with hatred. A sickening sense of superiority grew in him, a feeling as if he had the right to dictate her place in this world. He didn't see her as a person. He saw her only as a target, an object for his angry words, a target for his racist resentment. The man paused for a moment, clenching his fists and feeling hatred fill every cell in his body. Someone like her. His mind raced. Should know her place. He savored that feeling, that toxic sense of his power, and with each step, he moved closer to her like a predator targeting prey. Her back was straightened, but she seemed immersed in her thoughts, calm as a quiet river before a storm. The man grinned. She doesn't know what awaits her. The wind passed over his face, but he didn't care. He was sure he could humiliate her, break her spirit with one look, one word. His heart raced, but it wasn't fear, it was anticipation. Something terrible hung in the air, like a taut rope ready to break at any second. He stepped closer, feeling his confidence grow into insolence. The man stopped just a few feet away from the woman and looked at her face, not even trying to hide a mocking smirk. It was the same expression that promised humiliation and pain, as if he was already enjoying the coming spectacle in advance. "Hey, you," he began with a touch of contempt, as if her very presence here were a personal insult. His voice cut through the air, shattering the silence like a knife through glass. "What are you standing there for? You think you can look so free on the street?" He emphasized the word "you," putting the full weight of his hatred into it. He didn't need to shout. His quiet, drawn-out words flew through the air like red-hot needles. There was no doubt in his mind. She had to feel his superiority, to buckle under the weight of his racist taunts, to cringe at the humiliation he was so careful to put into his words. The woman seemed to hear him, but she didn't move. She didn't even turn her head in his direction. It made the man angry, made his gut boil. She should have reacted, should have shown fear, embarrassment, or at least politely stepped back, recognizing his strength. But her stillness, her indifference, was a challenge he couldn't ignore. He took another step closer, leaning in so that his shadow fell across her face, and continued, raising his voice. "You know people like you shouldn't be walking around here like nothing's wrong. You think you can afford to feel safe." The words were saturated with contempt, every letter announcing hatred. The man expected to see her nervousness, to see the worry in her eyes. He wanted to see her break, to see her seemingly calm confidence crumble. But so far it wasn't happening. Anger was building inside him, but there was something else in the air, something strange, something that made him doubt his actions a little. The silence that followed his words was heavy, pressing, like a thundercloud before a storm. The woman turned her head slowly, and their gazes met. Her eyes were clear, calm, as if there was no trace of the fear he had longed to see in them. A barely perceptible smile appeared on her lips, not humiliated, not intimidated, but confident. almost contemptuous. The man had not expected such a response. His breath hitched for a second, and then a new wave of anger rose in him. His heart sped up, not out of fear, but out of insulted dignity. It seemed inconceivable to him that someone like her could look at him with such an expression, such insolence. In his world, she should have lowered her eyes, hidden from his words, tried to avoid his anger, but her calmness seemed absurd, even defiant. "Didn't you hear me?" He stepped even closer, so close that he felt the evening air, heated by his own irritation, hit him in the face. "Or are you too proud to react to words that concern you?" He clenched his fists, barely keeping himself from doing anything more than throwing words. His voice rang with anger like an overheated wire. But she didn't blink, didn't take a step back. This woman seemed to know something the man couldn't understand, and it was driving him crazy. Her smile grew a little wider, and there was something frightening in that simple gesture. She looked at him with an expression as if she saw through him, as if she understood his weaknesses, his ugly nature. The man felt another chill run down his spine, but he quickly banished it, replacing it with a new dose of hatred. "Don't think I'm kidding," he growled, trying to get her to react in any way, to see her cracks, her weakness. "You're on my turf here, understand?" With these words, he leaned toward her again, trying to intimidate her, but the woman stood like a rock, unmoving and impenetrable. Her presence was beginning to make him uneasy, but he didn't want to admit it. Still believing in his own power, he couldn't foresee what her confident calm was hiding, or how it might turn out for him. In the light of the street lamps, which were beginning to come on one by one, the man looked even more gloomy. His face darkened with irritation, and his eyebrows drew together in a deep crease. He was used to the world bending to his rules. He was the one who made others feel helpless. The power he felt over people was his drug, a source of strength, especially when his victims were vulnerable like this black woman. Growing up surrounded by others like himself, he had absorbed a disdain for those who differed from him in skin color. He believed that people like her had no right to feel equal. To him, they always remained in the shadows, second-rate beings on whom to rain down all their venom. His prejudice was deep-seated, fed by his family, his environment, a society where contempt for others was the norm. Something unpleasant, almost sticky, stirred inside him. It was rage mixed with bewilderment. Why didn't she break? Why wasn't her gaze full of pleading, as he was used to seeing in those he considered weaker than himself? Every time he'd encountered people like her, he'd always gotten what he wanted: fear, pain, silence. But this woman, she wasn't acting the way he expected. It was as if she knew something he couldn't reach. He wanted to break her, to trample her confidence, to prove that her place was somewhere below his feet. He hadn't yet realized that her calmness and steadfastness were not just a challenge, but a threat to everything he believed in. His mind began to search for excuses. Maybe she was faking it. Maybe it was only outward confidence, but inside she was already trembling with fear. That thought gave him some of his confidence back. All they had to do was push a little harder, and everything would be just the way he was used to. He wouldn't tolerate anyone, especially someone like this, challenging him and going undefeated. "You think you can look at me like that?" he hissed, a little louder this time. There was an almost hysterical note in his voice. "I could do anything I wanted to you, and no one would make a peep." Those words should have sounded threatening, but the woman still stood still, not making the slightest movement that might betray her weakness. This time her gaze became even more focused, like a man preparing to reveal his most important secret. The man was sure he was never wrong in his assessment of people, but at that moment, in her stillness and quiet confidence, a fear began to slowly dawn that he was completely unprepared for. The man was still trying to keep a haughty expression on his face, but in the back of his mind, something akin to anxiety was beginning to boil up. He could feel the invisible wall of this woman's confidence rising higher and higher, separating him from what he had come to regard as his unquestioned authority. But despite his growing unease, his pride would not let him back down. He had been too long assured of his inviolability, too accustomed to having fear as his weapon. He took another step forward and invaded her personal space, deliberately moving so close that he could almost feel her breath. He wanted to badly to break her, to see even a glimmer of panic in her eyes. He was trying to show her that she meant nothing in this world, that he was the one who controlled everything that happened around him. "So, you've decided to keep quiet." He gritted his teeth, his voice growing rougher and rougher, a spark of desperation in it. "Do you think this game of quiet is going to help you?" He raised his hand, almost intending to touch her shoulder, but his movement frowned halfway when she finally spoke. Her voice was low, clear and calm, as if she were the one in control of everything that was happening around her. "If you've decided to try your luck, go ahead," she said, her words sounding like a warning, but not a threat. There was no fear in her tone, only confidence, as if she knew something he didn't. The man blinked, not expecting that answer. His hand frowned in midair, and he felt an icy chill run down his spine, but it suppressed the feeling again. He couldn't afford to show weakness, couldn't afford to lose this fight. It seemed to him that if he backed up, his fragile sense of superiority would crumble, and he couldn't let that happen. "What?" His voice was a little quieter, but it still sounded like he was trying to hold on to power. "You think you can threaten me?" The woman lifted her chin, her face still calm, and her eyes stared straight into his, as if they were unraveling his deepest fears. The man felt his confidence begin to shake with every word she said, like an old building in danger of collapsing, but he wasn't ready to back down. Not now. It was at that moment that he crossed a line beyond which there was no turning back. The thought flashed through his mind that perhaps he was making a mistake, but his pride drowned out that voice, ordering him to continue. He took the final step, testing the limits of her patience, not realizing that his own boundaries were about to crumble under the weight of what would happen next. It was beginning to get darker, and the shadows of the streetlights slowly surrounded them. Like invisible witnesses to what was happening, the man stood a step away from her, his breathing quickening, but he tried to pass it off as the excitement of victory. It seemed as if he was about to tear off her mask of indifference and see the real emotion he so desperately wanted to evoke. But the woman remained steadfast, her face expressing neither fear nor excitement. Only her eyes, large and penetrating, looked at him as if they knew everything about him. That look, full of silent challenge, was beginning to worry him. Something in her calm broke his confidence, as if her presence itself were a weapon against him. She didn't look away, and there was something in those eyes that made his heart go off its usual rhythm. It was more than strength, it was a mystery he couldn't solve. "Do you realize who you're messing with?" he almost shouted, his voice shaking, revealing the anxiety he was beginning to feel. The words came out with a harshness that masked a growing panic. He needed her to be frightened, for her expression to change, for him to feel in charge again. But her face didn't flinch, didn't reflect an ounce of the terror he'd hoped to see. She didn't answer, and that silent certainty was stronger than any shout, any response. The man felt his hands begin to tremble slightly, but he quickly hid them in his pockets, trying to hide the weakness. He looked at her and waited for her to do something that would justify his actions, his hatred, his confidence in his superiority. Instead, she did something unexpected. Her gaze became even more intense, almost hypnotic. There was a hard determination in her eyes, the kind that could break down any boundaries. There was something more in her gaze than mere defense or willingness to stand up for herself. It was the look of someone who knew the truth, and that truth was scarier than anything this man could imagine. He felt his confidence begin to crumble, like an old building with cracks in it. Her silent stillness seemed to penetrate his mind, shattering his confidence that he was invincible. He found it hard to breathe, and every moment of her silence was like a red-hot needle, burning him from the inside out. But even then, he didn't want to admit that he'd lost. His hatred mixed with his growing fear, and now he was no longer sure which of them was really in danger. Her stillness was becoming almost frightening. She stood like a rock, unruffled and solid, ready to withstand any onslaught. And in this silent confrontation, the man suddenly realized that his usual methods were no longer working. His threatening posture, his haughty voice, and his flashes of hatred left not the slightest trace on her. For the first time in a long time, he began to feel the thin, but always reliable veil of power slipping from his body. The man gritted his teeth again, trying to suppress the growing insecurity. He was used to breaking people, used to seeing them succumb to his brute force and hatred. But now something had gone wrong. The woman in front of him didn't look defeated, didn't look like someone who was ready to back down. There was power in her eyes, the kind of power that inspired awe and made his heart beat faster. He tried to justify it, telling himself that her calmness was just a mask, but in the back of his mind, a doubt aided him. What if her resilience was real? What if she wasn't just playing a role, but really someone who could defeat him? Taking another step, he raised his hand, not to strike, but more as a gesture to emphasize his attempt to hold on to his remaining power. The gesture looked pathetic. It no longer had the confidence that had come from him in the beginning, but he continued to hope that, at least outwardly, his contrived insolence might make her give in. Listen to me, he began, but his voice was shaking now, like an unsteady note threatening to break. You can't just stand here and stare at me with this damn confidence. You think you can resist me, don't you? You think you're better than me? Her answer was simple. The woman only raised an eyebrow, as if his tirade were nothing more than a childish whim. Her calmness spoke louder than all words. She wasn't afraid of him. Her steadfastness was deep, impenetrable, as if she knew that this man standing before her, with all his insults and hatred, was just a shadow, a ghost, incapable of doing her any real harm. The man felt his palms sweat. His fear grew, like a poisonous flower breaking through his confidence. This was wrong. It wasn't supposed to be like this. But something about this woman, about her silence and hard stare, filled him with a new, unfamiliar feeling. His hatred had run into a wall he didn't know how to fight against. And right then, in that instant, he realized that he was the one who had started to lose control. The noise of the street was almost silent, as if the city itself held its breath. Watching the tense scene, people passing by began to slow their steps, turning around and hiding their curiosity under a mask of indifference. Some watched from a distance, pretending not to be concerned, afraid to interface. Others, standing nearby, exchanged glances full of anxiety and embarrassment, but no one was in a hurry to step forward or raise his voice. The crowd around him was a silent assembly of observers, averting their eyes as soon as the man cast his sharp, threatening glances at them. They were witnesses to the scene, but not defenders, not participants. Their indifference was almost palpable, like a heavy veil dropped between the woman and the rest of the world. The man felt it. He knew that people were watching, that he was surrounded by attention. In a normal situation, it gave him strength, made his actions weightier, but now something was wrong. He no longer felt like the master of the situation. The stares directed at him seemed heavy, and he began to realize that he no longer looked invincible. He looked pathetic, and that made him furious. Well, he looked away, his eyes flashing with anger and his voice rising again. Are you all just going to stand there and watch? The question was addressed to the audience, but no one answered. People turned away, pretending not to see him, or lowered their heads as if they hoped their presence would not be noticed. The silence was another slap in the face to his already shaken sense of power. He had expected at least one of them to take his side, to support him as they had before, but it didn't happen. The fear of his aggression was too great, not because of respect or belief in his power, but because of a simple reluctance to interface. He was finding it harder and harder to breathe, and the clammy feeling of lost control crawled into his consciousness, squeezing his mind into a ring of panic. His hatred now seemed to him like some flimsy, rotten barrier that could collapse at any moment. He turned back to the woman again, but now something new flickered in his gaze, a tinge of desperation he couldn't hide. She was still standing in front of him, as if oblivious to the people around her, as if this audience were not witnesses, but merely background. Her strength came from within, and not even a down-scene averted eyes could take away the resilience. She didn't need anyone's support. Her calmness hit him harder than any shout. The man gritted his teeth. He couldn't afford to lose, but with each passing second, he realized more and more that this was exactly what was happening to him. The man stood there like a cornered animal, trying to maintain the remnants of his haughty appearance, but the tension around him was becoming almost unbearable. The air between him and the woman was saturated with menace, not the kind he was used to sensing, but a different kind, one beyond his control. The whole thing was beginning to feel like a hot spring, ready to burst at any moment. He could feel the drops of sweat rolling down his neck, but he couldn't understand why things weren't going as they usually did. His words, his threatening gestures, his hatred, everything that had worked before seemed useless now. He was used to his victims being afraid of him, that their fear fueled his power, but this woman stood before him like an impregnable fortress, her calmness an unbearable reminder that he was no longer in control. His pride was eating him up inside. She was his last bulwark, his last hope that he could turn the tide of this confrontation. He stepped forward, no longer to scare her, but to save his own face in front of the silent crowd that was beginning to press him even harder. He didn't want to admit that he wasn't just losing control, he'd already lost it. I'm not used to people like you challenging me, he growled, his voice no longer full of strength, but sounding like the last desperate call of a drowning man. The words were drenched in venom, but that venom was helpless. Its sharpness dulled under the weight of uncertainty. He'd hoped his racist attacks would break through her resilience, but even he was beginning to doubt their effectiveness. The woman squinted her eyes slightly, and that barely perceptible gesture was stronger than any shout. She finally answered, her voice as hard as granite, but just as cold. "Your words mean nothing to me," she said, as lowly, clearly, as if she were driving nails into his crumbling sense of superiority. "I've heard it all before, and I've heard it from people like you. You think your hatred can break me." Her voice didn't waver, not a shadow of weakness in it. "But the truth is, your hatred is your own burden." Those words pierced him like a cold blade. Her confidence, her firmness, was frightening, and he suddenly realized that his usual weapons against her were useless. He had nothing else to offer but his impotent anger. The tension around him was building, pressing in on him from all sides, and it felt he was on the edge of a precipice. At that moment, his rage began to turn into something new, fear. Fear that he was no longer in charge, that his aggression had lost its power, fear that the hatred he had built his superiority on was empty and weak in the face of real, genuine power. The man was gripped by a growing fear, and he felt rage boiling up inside him. It rose from the depths of his being, hot and uncontrollable, like a lava flow threatening to burst forth and burn everything around him. This anger was a reaction to his powerlessness, to his fear of a woman who not only didn't back down, but seemed to turn his aggression into nothing. He tried to regain control, clinging with all his might to the hatred that had once made him strong. Clenching his fists, he stepped even closer, so close that their faces almost touched. Words tumbled from his lips like sharp splinters, and every sound was filled with despair. "You don't know anything," he almost shouted, his voice trembling, revealing what he wanted most to hide. "You don't know how things work. You don't know who's in charge." His words became almost meaningless, like the hysterical cries of a hunted animal. He spoke not because he wanted to frighten her, but because he was afraid of the silence. He needed to shout, to fill the void between them with his hatred, or he might lose himself in the silent, destructive stillness with which the woman surrounded him. It was a last desperate attempt to maintain his superiority, but with every word he uttered, he realized more and more how pathetic he was becoming. The woman looked at him with the same calmness that was now shattering his confidence. Her face remained impenetrable, and her eyes bored into his, as if trying to penetrate to the very depths of his soul. She saw his fear, his confusion, his attempt to hide his weakness behind a screen of hatred, and it left him no chance. The crowd around him began to whisper, and the man could feel the whispers getting under his skin like poison. They saw his humiliation, watched his attempt to control the situation turn into a farce, and the angrier he got, the more that anger exposed his helplessness. He screamed because the silence had become unbearable. His own voice was becoming the enemy, revealing a truth he could not accept. "You're just," his voice choked in his own rage, the words scattering like broken glass. It was no longer he, but she who was the center of the scene, who held the invisible force that brought him to his knees in front of all the witnesses. At that moment he realized that his anger did not frighten her. On the contrary, her calmness drove him deeper and deeper into his own terror. Nothing he could say or do could change that fact. The woman he tried to humiliate wasn't just unafraid of him. She had completely destroyed his power. The man frowned, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling as if after a grueling struggle. Doubt began to slowly flare inside him, weaving into his anger like thin, cold snakes clutching at his heart. He had never felt so vulnerable. All his life he had believed that his strength and aggression were his weapons, his defense against a world he felt obligated to obey. But now that confidence was beginning to crumble, like old bricks from a crumbling wall. He looked around, all around, the same people who pretended they weren't here, who were afraid to take a step forward. He was the center of attention, and every averted or furtive glance in his direction only added fuel to the fire of his rage. But now fear was mixed in with the rage, not of the woman, but of something deeper and more frightening. The truth he so desperately didn't want to admit. Maybe I was wrong. A traitorous thought flashed through his mind. He dismissed it with a clench of his jaw, but the doubt, once there, would not go away. His familiar world was beginning to crack at the seams. He was used to people being afraid of him, but this woman standing in front of him was not. Her eyes were still drilling him with a gaze that held not a shred of fear, only a firm, unwavering confidence. It was as if she saw through him, knew his weaknesses, knew that all his hatred was just a cover. "What are you? What do you think you're doing?" He spoke, and his voice was no longer as strong as it had been before. It sounded like a false, tortured order, addressed not so much to her as to himself. He needed to convince himself that he was still in charge, that she couldn't shake his world. The woman took a step forward, only one step, but the gesture hit him harder than any shout. He felt his knees shake, and he could barely keep from stepping back. Panic flashed through his mind. If he retreated, he would lose, but even standing still, he already realized he had lost. His hatred, his anger, his aggression all were empty weapons, useless against her unshakable confidence. Now his fear was becoming apparent. He was beginning to realize that he wasn't in control, didn't have the power he was used to. His hatred could not crush her, and his strength was crumbling in the face of her hardness. The man clenched his fists so that his nails dug into his palms, but even that couldn't quell the emptiness growing inside. He began to realize that this whole spectacle played out in front of the crowd no longer made sense. His words were empty, his actions meaningless, and now he was faced with a choice: to continue to cling to his crumbling sense of superiority or to recognize that everything he knew about himself and his power was only an illusion. The man felt his inner defenses crumble like a house of cards shattered by a gust of wind. His pride, which had always been his fortress, became a shaking, barely visible shield. The woman took another step forward, and this time, her calmness was like an icy blade penetrating the darkest corners of his soul. Instead of threatening again, or hurling a new stream of racist insults, the man frowned, unable to think of what to say. His brain was frantically searching for a way out, but all the usual strategies were useless. The aggression with which he was accustomed to destroying his opponents was powerless in the face of her resilience. And then something happened that he hadn't expected at all. The woman spoke. Her voice was low, calm, and utterly confident, as if she no longer needed to shout or threaten to establish her authority. There was no anger in that voice, only unwavering truth. "I don't have to be afraid of you," she said, looking him straight in the eye. "Your arrogance, your hatred, it's all hollow. It's just a shell you wear to hide your fears. You think your rage can destroy others, but in fact, it only devours you." The man couldn't believe his ears. Her words, spoken so calmly, shattered his confidence to pieces. She spoke of him as if she knew him better than he knew himself. Her gaze pierced through him, leaving no hidden corner. He felt his face go pale and his heart start to pound as if it were trying to break free. He wanted to answer, but his voice trailed off, betraying his uncertainty. He wanted to object, wanted to regain control, but the words stuck in his throat. What she was saying was unbearably true. He felt as if her words were shattering everything he thought about himself. His power, his superiority, all of it became insignificant in an instant. The woman took another step forward, and now there were only a few centimeters between them. She was shorter than him, but at this moment her strength was overwhelming. The man felt an icy chill run down his back and couldn't understand how this had happened. How he had found himself in a situation where he, who had always been the aggressor, now stood on the edge of her power that was cracking at the seams. "You used to people being afraid of you," she continued. "You used to people being afraid of you," she continued. "But it ends here. You can yell, you can threaten, but I won't break. You don't control me anymore." Every word she said hit his ego like a heavy hammer. The man clenched his fists again, but no longer from rage, but from the fear that was growing inside him, becoming unbearable. She was no longer a victim. She had become a force that not only stood up to his hatred, but exposed all his weakness. He suddenly found it hard to breathe. He felt that he was losing ground beneath his feet, that his world was crumbling, and now, for the first time in all this time, he realized the terrible truth. He was the one in danger. The man didn't know how to react to her words. The panic inside him was becoming more and more distinct, overwhelming his mind, blurring the lines between his rage and his utter powerlessness. The sense of his vulnerability was new and frightening to him. He couldn't allow himself to show weakness, not in front of this woman, not in front of all these people who were watching this humiliation. And then he did the only thing left to do. He laughed. His laugh was rough, hoarse, filled with false bravado, a desperate attempt to regain some shade of confidence. It was the laugh of a man who didn't know how else to react, the laugh of someone who could no longer hide his lostness behind a mask of aggression. "Are you serious?" he wheezed, trying to keep his voice sharp. The laughter still rumbled from his throat, but there was nothing joyful about it. It was like a cry of despair, a weak attempt to convince himself and everyone around him that he was still in control. You think your little lecture is going to make a difference? You think I'm going to be afraid of what you say? His eyes roved over the faces of the people gathered around him. He saw someone struggling to conceal contempt, someone holding back compassion for a woman, and it only added to his inner horror. He was in plain sight, exposed, unarmed, and that laughter, that desperate, strained laughter, was his last defense. The woman didn't back down. Her face remained firm, and she didn't raise an eyebrow at his harsh, strained laughter. He couldn't understand why his usual tricks weren't working anymore. Why didn't she feel broken, intimidated, humiliated? Why couldn't his rage, which always intimidated others, break her? Are you laughing? She asked with mocking ease, and her calmness only increased his fear. Your laughter does not hide your fear. I can see it. You're trembling not because I'm threatening you, but because you've realized that your words no longer mean anything. Those words were like an icy blow. The man felt his face flush with a shame he couldn't control. The crowd around him frowned, and their silence was another needle in his pride. He wanted to do something, anything, to regain power, but his laughter began to turn into a nervous, suppressed sob. He stepped back, trying to maintain at least a semblance of control, but his legs were shaking, and now his every gesture looked pathetic and inept. The realization flared within him that he had not only lost, but had been exposed. His strength was an illusion, his aggression a weakness, and his hatred nothing more than a defense mechanism shattered in front of this unwavering woman. Suddenly it became clear to him that people around him saw not his power, but his fear. The laughter he was trying to use to escape only betrayed his powerlessness, and this realization came upon him with devastating force. The man stood still, his nervous laughter fading, leaving behind an emptiness and a heavy, visceral sense of defeat. His face now showed confusion and almost childlike incomprehension of what was happening. It was hard for him to believe that things had really gone this far. Just a moment ago he had been sure that it could crush her, that his hatred could crush her resilience. But now, standing in front of her and seeing her steadfastness, he began to realize that his power was an illusion. In that instant, the woman decided to unleash her power. She looked at him with a new expression that had something almost frightening in it, something that made his blood run cold in his veins. She was no longer just a silent victim facing his wrath. Now she had become a source of power that the man couldn't ignore. Slowly but surely, she reached up and pulled something shiny out of her pocket. The man tensed, his mind instantly filled with panic and speculation. But what she pulled out was not at all what he expected. It was a badge, and in the light of the street lamp, the metal plate shone so brightly that it caught the attention of the entire crowd. The badge had letters on it that he couldn't read at first, but the meaning was obvious. I'm a federal agent, she said firmly, and her voice sounded so resolute that the man jerked back as if he'd been punched in the chest. There was no calm in her eyes now, only the cold certainty of a man who was ready to use his power if necessary. And your hatred means nothing here. The words were like a sentence. The man felt his legs shaking. Everything he had worked so hard to build up inside him, all his fabricated excuses and racist rage, now crumbled in an instant. His power, his strength that he used to rely on, crumbled before this woman, before her strength that he couldn't break. He was trapped, and now it was obvious to anyone who stood watching. Are you a federal agent? He squeezed it out with difficulty, his voice full of disbelief and fear. He tried to find some excuse, some loophole, but her badge was a reality he couldn't escape. She wasn't just a strong woman, she was a man of the law, and now his whole pathetic act had turned against him. The crowd around them gasped, and people began to whisper. Some took out their phones to film the scene. Others backed away fearfully, realizing that this had taken an unexpected turn. The man saw it, felt the ground go from under his feet, and his panic could no longer be hidden. Everything he had known was shattered in an instant. The woman took another step forward, and now she was a commanding, threatening force he could no longer shake off. Her eyes did not glitter with fury, but there was an unrelenting determination in them, and he realized that his fear had reached its climax. The man frowned, as if time had suddenly stopped and the reality around him had solidified into an indestructible wall into which he was slamming with all his helplessness. At that moment, a realization swept over him, chilling his body and making the blood in his veins freeze. This was not just a woman he had thought of as a defenseless target for his insults and hatred. This was someone whose power was real, undeniable, protected by law, and now she could hold him accountable for everything he'd done. The man felt a shiver run down his back. He couldn't hide this fear that was written on his face, couldn't bring himself to return to his former aggression. It no longer made sense. Now that he had a federal agent standing in front of him, his pathetic words and threats were nothing, scattered like dust in the wind. The crowd around them frowned in anticipation, and all attention was focused on what would happen next. A moment stretched on, the silence tearing the air, and every sound, the distant footsteps of passersby, the whispering of people, the noise of cars seemed deafening. The man who had once seemed so sure of his power now looked pathetic, almost broken. He didn't know what to do, didn't know where to get away from the woman's gaze, which now pierced him through and through. "You thought you'd get away with it," she said quietly, but her words sounded louder and scarier than any threat. "You're used to humiliation, to pain, to being superior, but you were wrong, and now you have to answer for everything." Her voice was cold, but not hostile. There was a hard, unwavering justice in it, and it was far more frightening than rage. The man felt something break in his soul as his hatred, everything that had fueled his sense of superiority, shattered. He took a step back, his eyes darting around for escape, but there was no way out. The woman's gaze held him in place like invisible shackles. "I didn't mean to," he began to stammer, his voice weak and hoarse, a desperate attempt to justify himself. "It was just a misunderstanding. I didn't know." That he trailed off when he saw that her eyes didn't express the slightest compassion. These pathetic attempts to regain a modicum of control looked ridiculous and pathetic, and he felt it himself. His mind was racing with thoughts. How could this have happened? How could he, the one who had always been strong and dangerous, end up as the vulnerable, defenseless man everyone saw through? The crowd began to whisper louder and louder, and he realized that this was no longer just a coincidence. This was his shame, exposed in front of everyone. The man took a step back again, his body shaking like a leaf in the wind. He suddenly wanted to run away, to hide, to disappear, but he knew he could not escape this truth. The woman looked at him the way one looks at someone doomed to face the consequences of their actions. And there was not malice in that look, but knowledge. She knew that justice was not always loud, but always inexorable. Everything around the man became murky. The reality he was used to control now seemed distorted, alien. He wanted to believe it was just a nightmare, but the cold sweat on his back and the humiliating sensation of the crowd's gaze reminded him that what was happening was real. He looked at the woman in front of him again. How could he have ever thought her weak? Now her figure was the epitome of strength, calm and confident, like a quiet but unconquerable storm. The stark contrast between them was becoming more and more apparent. He, bulky and once formidable, crushed by panic and confusion, and she, calm, unwavering, with a dignity that shone in her every movement. The man began to feel all his old beliefs crumbling. A mixture of horror, shame, and an overwhelming desire to disappear bubbled up inside him. "Please," he squeezed out in a choked voice, taking another step back. His smugness and anger were replaced by a pathetic plea, his voice losing the harshness with which he had so proudly insulted her. He was left with nothing but helplessness, and that was worse for him than any punishment. "I didn't know that you were such a..." He said it with a wry, strained grin that quickly disappeared when the woman took another step toward him. She was shorter than him, her figure seeming frail in comparison to his massive body, but he knew now that strength was not about physical power. He felt small, helpless, like a child standing before an adult who knew that justice was inevitable. The crowd whispered louder, and the man noticed some of the onlookers starting to film what was happening on their phones. Until a few moments ago, he'd enjoyed the attention, used it as a tool of his superiority. Now that attention was burning his skin, turning him into an object of contempt and curiosity. He staggered back even more, his hands clenched into fists, not to attack, but to hide his trembling. The woman squinted her eyes, but her voice remained as steady as ever, as if his humiliation was only part of a great, inexorable justice. "You didn't know," she repeated, as if trying his words on a scale. "But that's no excuse. You're used to being able to act the way you want, thinking no one can stop you, used to using your hatred as a weapon. But now it's time to face reality." Those words, so simple and calm, were the final blow to him. The man saw his false notions crumble into ashes. He was a man accustomed to his supposed power, to a sense of superiority that he believed gave him the right to humiliate and attack. But now he was facing a woman who no longer allowed him to dominate, and that realization was eating him up inside. His voice became weak, almost pathetic, as he tried to speak again. I didn't mean for it to go this far." But she didn't look away, and her silence spoke louder than any words. The man realized that his remorse, even if it was sincere, would not change anything. His mind was seized by a realization that came upon him with devastating force. The man replayed over and over in his head everything he had said to the woman. All the racist insults he had shouted with such certainty took on a new meaning, heavy and unbearable. Every word he uttered now seemed like a stigma left on his soul. He remembered the taunts, the threats, his vile sense of superiority with which he had tried to break her spirit. The contrast between what he had been just a few minutes ago and what he was now was eating him up inside. Not so long ago he had believed in his power, that his hatred made him strong, that he would always be able to use his preconceived beliefs to rise above others. But now, as he stood before a woman who had not only stood her ground, but had managed to make him look real, he felt insignificant. Each of his words came back to him like an echo that could no longer be drowned out. "You think you can walk around here like nothing happened?" His own voice in his head sounded mocking and alien, making him shrink in shame. "People like you should know their place." At the moment he'd said it, he had enjoyed his supposed power, but now those phrases seemed like a weapon that turned against himself. His skin flared with shame, and his whole body felt like it was cramped. The man knew that his behavior would not be without consequences. This woman he tried to humiliate hadn't just rebuffed him. She made him vulnerable to everyone watching the scene, and to himself. He saw the truth in her eyes. His hatred, his aggression were not strength, but weakness. The weakness of a man who hid his fears behind a wall of contempt. He could no longer deny that he would have to answer for his actions. This woman was no longer just a target for his attacks. She had become a symbol that would no longer allow him to go unpunished. He saw the people around him recording what was happening, saw their judgmental looks, felt the weight of their contempt. The man felt panic growing inside him. His heart was pounding in his chest and his hands were trembling. He tried to suppress this fear, but now it was clear to him that nothing would change what had happened. The consequences of his words and actions were beginning to take effect, and it was clear to him that it was useless to run. The man stood there, losing all his confidence, and his body seemed to shrink with terror. He felt the world around him shrinking, pushing him into a corner from which there was no escape. Until a few moments ago, he had thought he was in control, that his words could break anyone. But now that confidence had turned to ashes. Instead of feeling strong, he found himself completely vulnerable, exposed in front of a woman he couldn't break in a crowd that now looked at him with judgment. He took a step back, his legs trembling. Retreating was shameful, but it seemed to him the only way to escape the humiliation that had fallen upon him. He tried to meet the woman's gaze, but her calm and unwavering expression, her incorruptible strength, made him lower his eyes again. Two feelings struggled inside him. Rage, stripped of its former sharpness, and panic, which flooded his whole being. He squeezed out, but the words stuck in his throat. They didn't matter anymore. They couldn't exonerate him, couldn't erase his guilt, couldn't make this crowd forget what they'd seen. Someone behind him stepped forward, and he felt his whole body stiffen with fear. The crowd was no longer afraid of him. They looked at him now, seeing him not as a formidable aggressor, but as a pathetic, frightened man who had lost everything that had once given him strength. Shame burned inside him, and he couldn't take it anymore. The man began to back away. Each step backward was like an admission of defeat. He could no longer look into the eyes of the woman he was trying to humiliate. She now towered over him, not physically, but mentally. Her power was real, genuine. He stepped back again, stumbling for a moment, and that brought new looks from the crowd, some holding back a chuckle, some looking at him with outright contempt. Finally, fear and shame consumed him completely. The man turned and fled. His feet carried him away from this place, from these people, from her gaze. He ran without looking back, like a hunted animal about to be overtaken by the reality of his actions. His heart pounded in his chest, his breathing became ragged, and every step hurt his ego. He was no longer the aggressor, but a fugitive, and that realization tore at his mind, exposing the weakness he'd hidden behind a wall of hatred for so long. Shame was driving him forward, and he did not know where he was running. He just wanted to disappear, to hide from the eyes of those who saw him as he really was, not strong but broken, not powerful but insignificant. As soon as the man rushed away, the audience, which until that moment had remained in tense silence, seemed to wake up. The crowd suddenly came to life, and there were shouts of surprise, whispers, and even quiet taunts. The people who minutes earlier had been spectators of this tense scene now felt the tension begin to subside, leaving behind a sense of relief and a strange sense of triumph. "Look at him run," someone grinned, and that quiet but mocking comment set off a wave of whispers that rippled through the crowd. The once formidable aggressor, who had fueled hatred and puffed himself up with his false sense of superiority, was now running, leaving behind a trail of his own humiliation. His bravery, his arrogance, his menacing aura all evaporated into the air like mist in the morning sun. The audience began to murmur, and each witness to this disgrace experienced the event in his own way. Some sighed with undisguised relief that it was over without violence, that evil had been destroyed by its own weakness. Others, those who had been shocked by his words and attacks, now looked on with a sense of deep satisfaction. This man who had thought himself all-powerful was now exposed, and his escape seemed an act of justice. "He got what he deserved," someone said, and people around him nodded. No one tried to stop the man, who was running away, losing what little dignity he had left. He was nothing more than a coward now, running away from the consequences of his actions. Some of the witnesses looked at the woman, who stood in the center of this animated scene. There was still power in her eyes, but now there was a slight weariness, like a man who had finally survived a long battle. She did not look triumphant, nor did she look to be enjoying his defeat. Her face expressed only the calmness and dignity with which she accepted this victory. She didn't need applause. She didn't need recognition. Her triumph was internal, deep and real. The audience now realized the significance of the moment. People exchanged glances. Some nodded approvingly, recognizing that they had witnessed not just a clash, but something more: the exposure of injustice, the fall of false greatness. The power embodied in the woman had left a mark on them, something more than just a memory of the drama. Somewhere in the distance was the sound of running footsteps, and it still echoed in my ears, reminding me that aggression and hatred could never truly make someone strong. The woman stood in the center of the whole scene, surrounded by the stares of people, but remained remarkably calm. Her tormentor, the one who a few minutes ago had seemed so loud and threatening, now fled away, leaving behind him a trail of his own humiliation. His heavy footsteps were receding, and the sound of his hasty flight gradually faded away, dissolving into the noise of the city. But she did not avert her eyes, did not turn her head. She stood straight, her gaze still focused, hard. The silence that hung in the air after his escape seemed almost sacred. The people around them frowned, realizing that they had witnessed something important. No one rushed to break the silence. The audience felt the power of her triumph, but it was a victory that needed no words or unnecessary explanations. Her steadfastness spoke for itself, her incorruptible calm louder than any celebration. She watched her tormentor disappear, and there was no trace of gloating or hatred in her eyes, only a deep sense of dignity. Her silence, the confidence with which she stood, was a powerful reminder that true strength is not in shouting, not in hatred, but in the ability to weather the storm, to stay true to oneself and one's convictions. She didn't need to shout her victory. Her presence, her incorruptibility, spoke more than words could express. Some of the people in the crowd began to nod slowly, acknowledging her strength. It was respect, sincere and genuine. People saw that she had come out of this fight victorious, not through revenge or aggression, but through her calmness and determination. Her triumph did not call for wild applause or loud cheers. It was a moment of inner, deep triumph. The woman took a breath, then exhaled, letting the tension build up in her body slowly drift away. But she still didn't lower her eyes. She knew that her strength was not in humiliating her enemy, but in standing firm, not giving in to an inch of hatred, even when all the shadows of the world were bearing down on her. Her triumph was that she kept herself, kept her humanity, despite all the poison that was trying to rain down on her. The crowd began to disperse, but people continued to cast respectful glances at her. It was a moment that would remain in their memories, a reminder that strength and dignity always win. The woman didn't say a word, didn't try to explain how she felt. Her silence was the loudest and most vivid response to everything that had happened. The woman continued to stand still, even as the crowd began to disperse, and the noise of the city filled the space around her again. But the tension still hummed inside her for a long time, like the echoes of a recent battle. Her face remained collected and calm, but her thoughts raged. Returning to what had just happened, she thought about how people often judge by appearances without having the slightest idea of who was in front of them. How easy it is, she thought, for people to be wrong, looking only at what is visible on the surface. Her aggressor thought himself powerful, believing that his hatred and contempt entitled him to power over others. He looked at her and saw only her appearance, a woman, black, in his eyes, vulnerable and weak. He thought she would fear him, that her pride and resilience could be crushed with a single word. But he was wrong. Like so many before him, he had failed to see the real strength behind her appearance, the strength that came not from physical power but from the depths of her spirit. She knew that people like him were used to the world being subject to their whims. They hoped their aggression could silence people, humble them, give in. But her strength was in her not letting the world change her essence. Her strength was in her silence, in the resilience that had withstood years of prejudice and injustice. And now, standing here, she thought about how many in this world who don't know who they're dealing with until it's too late. How often people are wrong, she pondered, looking only at the surface. Her tormentor had relied on his hatred, thinking it would make him strong, but he didn't know that hate is a fragile weapon that crumbles at the slightest resistance. He didn't realize that true strength is not power over someone, but the ability to be true to oneself, even in the face of evil. She thought of other people she had met in her life. How many times they tried to break her. How many times they thought they knew her just by looking at her exterior, without realizing what was inside. And each time she faced such prejudice, she only clung tighter to her dignity. Her strength was born from pain, from those moments when she didn't let herself be broken, when she stood firm even when it seemed impossible. People will always judge, she thought, but it's their mistakes, their illusions. That shouldn't touch my truth. Her truth was deeper than they could comprehend. Her strength was one that was not immediately apparent, but which crushed anyone who tried to break it. These reflections brought her calm. She took another deep breath, allowing herself to let go of any remaining tension. She knew there would be new challenges ahead, but now, in this moment, she was sure of one thing. Her power was real, enduring, and no one else could make her forget it. The woman walked slowly down the street, absorbed in thought. Her thoughts returned to the heart of the problem she had just witnessed and participated in. This incident was not an isolated incident. It reflected something much larger and more destructive, rooted in the very fabric of society. The bias she had just experienced was a symptom of a disease that lived in the hearts and minds of many people. She knew that racism had not gone away, that it still thrived, lurking in habits, words, attitudes. It was not only open, overt racism, but also a hidden hatred, silent, almost invisible, but no less dangerous. How many times has she noticed how people looked at her with suspicion, how she was ignored or devalued, without knowing anything about her other than the color of her skin? How many times had she heard stories of others facing similar injustices, of being made to feel second to class, just because someone believed they were superior? Why is this happening? She asked herself. Why, in a world where so many people strive for progress, is prejudice still so strong? Her tormentor was just one of many who felt entitled to humiliate, to belittle others based on stereotypes he had absorbed from childhood. He believed that his hatred gave him power, that his aggression would go unchecked, because there was still tacit social approval of such acts. She thought about how often aggressors feel unpunished. They were used to no one stopping them, to their hatred going unnoticed or even supported. Racism was not just one man's mistake. It was a systemic problem rooted in history, in cultures, in institutions that refused to change. For many like her tormentor, hate was a familiar way to feel powerful, but in reality, it only exposed their fears and insecurities. How to change this cycle? She knew that one incident wasn't enough to fix society's deep-seated problems, but each encounter with bias was a reminder of the need to fight back. Too many were used to averting their eyes, not intervening, pretending nothing was happening. Silence was complicit, allowing the aggressors to feel unpunished. And every time people remained silent, every time they did not stand up for justice, bias continued to bloom like a poisonous flower. But what can we do? The woman believed that power is not only in action, but also in words. In discussion, in education, she wanted to believe that people could change, that society could become better, but she knew it would take time, effort, and endless patience. She knew that fighting bias meant confronting not only other people's hatred, but also entrenched systems. Her reflections were heavy, but there was something else in them: determination. She knew she couldn't change the world alone, but she could continue to stand up for herself and others, to lead by example, to fight injustice every time she encountered it. And even if change didn't come immediately, she was willing to follow that path. The man ran away, his heavy footsteps growing more and more muffled, until they disappeared into the noise of the city streets. But his shouts of rage and fear hung in the air like a poisonous cloud, from which there was no escape. Those hateful words continued to echo in the ears of those gathered as a bitter reminder that anger and prejudice are still deeply rooted in society. The people around him could feel the echo. It was pervasive, painful, filling the space with an unpleasant sensation that pressed hard on the chest. It wasn't just one person's echo, but a collective cry that symbolized centuries of hatred, still alive and destructive. Even those who usually try to ignore such incidents could not ignore the obvious. The hatred had not gone anywhere. It was here, in this city, among them, and it was impossible not to feel its weight. Some witnesses were relieved that the threat had passed, but others were distressed by this ominous reminder. One of them, an elderly man with a tired face, shook his head as if he could not believe that all this was still happening in the modern world. The woman next to him hugged the child tighter, her eyes full of anxiety, and she seemed ready to protect him from this hatred that seemed so close and dangerous. The echo of hatred left its trace in each of them, as if a warning that this darkness lived nearby. People could not shake off this feeling, even when they tried to go back to their business. It was hard for them to feel safe again because the man's screams, his racist insults, exposed the fragile reality in which they lived. This hatred could erupt anywhere and at any moment. The woman standing in the center of this epicenter felt this echo especially keenly. Her body was tense, as if it were absorbing the remnants of this poisonous energy, but she didn't let herself tremble, didn't let this hatred penetrate her heart. She knew that this echo of hatred was not just the cry of a frightened man fleeing from his own shame. It was the voice of the whole system, the voice of prejudice that said she should not feel safe, that her place here would always be challenged. She stood, slowly taking breath after breath, trying to clear her mind of this poison. She knew the hatred would be there for a long time, but she wouldn't let it become a part of her. Her strength lay in staying true to herself, not giving in to this evil that was trying to destroy her. There were people around whose faces expressed gratitude and respect, and it reminded her that despite all the hate, there was good around. The echo of hatred will not disappear immediately. It would haunt her and everyone else here, but she believed that every resilient response, every victory over this evil left a little more light in the world, which would eventually supplant the darkness, and she was determined that she would not let that echo be the last word. The man continued to run without looking back, his breath hitching and his heart pounding in his chest with such force that it felt like it was about to jump out. Fear and shame filled his mind, turning his every step into a flight from his own shame. He dashed through the streets, hoping to hide in faceless alleys where no one would know his name, where no one would recognize him as the one who had just suffered a crushing defeat. But no matter where he ran, he couldn't escape his mind. The woman's words kept echoing in his head, her gaze full of confidence and dignity as if chasing him. That moment, when his aggression ran into the wall of her strength, was imprinted in his memory like a scorched brand. He would never forget how his hatred turned to nothing in the face of her resilience. Her calmness had exposed his fears, and now he realized that hatred was its own burden, heavy and useless. He reached his house, panting and trembling, closing the door behind him. The man sank to the floor, feeling his body shudder with shame and humiliation. It was hard for him to breathe. The walls seemed to shrink around him, reminding him how little his supposed power meant the moment it was truly experienced. He had been certain that he controlled his destiny, that his hatred made him strong, but now that feeling had melted away, leaving only emptiness. A scar of shame began to form in his soul. He remembered how the crowd had watched him flee, their judgmental gazes digging into his back. That shame wasn't just humiliation. It was the shattered image of himself that he had cherished for so long. He had always thought that his aggression and hatred made him superior to others, but now realized that they made him weak, cowardly. Sitting in his room, he began to realize that this moment had changed him forever. The doubts he had been chasing away all his life now filled his mind. How could he have been so blind? He asked himself. How could he allow himself to think that hate was a source of strength? His prejudice, his arrogance, all these years he had carried them like a shield, not realizing that this shield was made of glass that cracked at the first real blow. Remembering the woman's gaze, the man felt something inside him slowly crumble. It was an agonizing realization. He could no longer see himself as the man he used to be. He realized that his hatred and prejudice would never make him strong. A feeling akin to regret sprang up in his soul, but along with it came fear. What if he could no longer regain his familiar world? What if this scar of shame would be with him forever, reminding him of how low he had fallen? That encounter had left a deep mark on him. It was a lesson he would never forget, a scar that would remind him of his weakness, of his inability to destroy the one he had tried to break. And now he was alone with that realization, not knowing how to move on with his life when his world was shattered and his former confidence was gone forever. The woman finally moved away from where the incident had occurred, but her thoughts kept returning to what had happened. This encounter was not just a moment of resistance in the face of an aggressor. It was a powerful reminder of how deeply rooted bias and hatred are in society. She knew that what happened was not an isolated incident. It was just one episode in a long chain of events that had been repeated over and over again, sometimes with less happy outcomes. She thought about people who judge others based on the color of their skin, not realizing the damage their prejudice does. How many people there are in the world who make decisions based on appearance alone, who think themselves superior and stronger simply because of the privileges bestowed upon them by society. This lesson her tormentor had just learned was important not only for him, but for all those who had ever thought they had the right to humiliate, hurt, or dominate someone simply because their view of the world was limited by hatred. This incident was a reminder that bias is the weapon of the weak. It never makes people strong. It feeds on fear, ignorance, and a false sense of superiority. But such strength is illusory. It crumbles like a fragile sandcastle when confronted with real fortitude, dignity, and truth. The woman knew that fighting this hatred was a hard and long road, but she also knew that every moment of resistance mattered. Every time a person stands up against injustice makes society change a little bit. She hoped that those who witnessed the scene would take the lesson away with them, that they would reflect on what they had seen and reconsider their own beliefs. After all, change begins with awareness, with a willingness to look at the world more broadly than before, a willingness to accept that strength is not in aggression, but in understanding, in humanity, in the desire to protect, not to humiliate. For the man who ran from his shame, it was a painful lesson that would probably change him forever. But for everyone else, it was a chance to reflect, to rethink. For as long as hate exists, there are those who are willing to challenge it. Strength lies in not backing down in the face of injustice, in standing tall, in being true to oneself despite pain and fatigue. She knew there was still a lot of fighting ahead, but this moment, this reminder, this victory, achieved without hatred, would stay with her and with those who saw it. The story was not just about the clash, but about the fact that everyone has the power to change the course of events if they don't stay silent, if they don't turn a blind eye. And that was her belief that the world can become a better place if people are willing to learn, to change, and to look at each other with understanding rather than prejudice. With these thoughts, she continued on her way, firmly knowing that her strength was something that nothing could break. Friends, what do you think about this story? Write in the comments, have you ever experienced racism or injustice? How have you dealt with such situations? We really need to know your opinions, your stories. Each of you is incredibly important to us, and we appreciate each of you supporting our community and sharing your thoughts and experiences. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like. Your support helps us grow and tell more meaningful stories. We wish you a great day, and remember, every voice you have matters, and together we can create a more understanding and just world. Thank you for being with us.